At first glance, Senegal and Congo may appear to have vastly different currencies, but in reality, they are both part of a larger system that links their currencies to the euro. This system is managed by the French Treasury and is based on the CFA franc, which is a crucial tool of French policymaking. Through the CFA franc, France has significant control over the monetary sovereignty of 14 nations, with a combined population of almost 200 million people. These nations include Benin, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, the Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and the Central African Republic. Although these countries have independent representation at the United Nations and have their own flags, the fundamental conduct of business remains largely unchanged from the days of colonial imperialism. The primary difference is that while imperialism used to be enforced through military might, today it is often accomplished through economic power. The ability to create money is not the true challenge. The real difficulty lies in convincing others to accept it. In the days before European colonialism, many African societies used cowrie seashells as a form of currency. These shells were so widely used that by 1800, they had an official exchange rate with the French currency. However, as the French Empire expanded its reach in Africa, Paris sought to control these networks of production and trade. Taxes were imposed in France, and armed troops were sent to markets to compel merchants to accept French currency. This process effectively eliminated the use of cowrie shells as a medium of exchange and consolidated economic power in the hands of the colonizers. Starting from the 1930s, French-speaking African countries saw France become the dominant force in their money supply. This newfound power brought along with it additional benefits for the French government, such as access to African labor and raw materials, at prices lower than market rates. Simultaneously, finished goods were sold back to African nations at prices that exceeded the market rates. This form of French neocolonialism was so assertive, unyielding, and unique that it even had its name, France Afrique. After the conclusion of World War II, there was a significant shift in economic policy. Paris joined the Bretton Woods system, which led to the devaluation of the French franc in order to establish a fixed exchange rate with the US dollar. These fiscal changes occurred at a time when many African countries were pursuing independence, and the devaluation of the franc only served to intensify the growing unrest. In an effort to maintain its control over its African colonies, France introduced a new currency called the CFA franc in 1945, which it compelled its colonies to adopt. Initially, the CFA franc was linked to the French franc at a rate of 1.7 to 1. But in 1948, the exchange rate between the CFA franc and the French franc was increased from 1.7 to 2. By overvaluing the CFA franc, France was able to maintain its economic advantage while simultaneously undermining the export competitiveness of African countries. As a result, a portion of France's post-war recovery was funded through a wealth transfer from Africa. However, the most effective methods of control are often those that are invisible. Recognizing this, France took steps in 1958 to undermine genuine decolonization by installing local collaborators in positions of power and granting them statehood. These collaborators became the custodians of France's neocolonial empire by maintaining the Franc zone and French military bases. When France offered its African colonies the CFA franc, Guinea was the only nation that declined the proposal. Ahmed Sékou Touré, the leader of Guinea, declared that his people preferred to be impoverished but free rather than wealthy but enslaved. Guinea refused to adopt the CFA franc and instead sought to develop its own currency. In response, France sought to make an example of Guinea. It cut pensions to war veterans, dismantled Guinea's power grid, and even tried to block its membership in the United Nations. In a further effort to punish Guinea, France flooded the country with counterfeit bills, inducing hyperinflation. Meanwhile, France funded armed anti-government groups, leading to a state of chaos in the country. So, yeah, things got pretty wild. Although the plan failed to remove Sékou Touré from power, Guinea's economy never fully recovered. Similarly, when Togo attempted to abandon the CFA franc, France again made an example of the country. This time, there were no loose ends. Togo's leader, Sylvanus Olympio, was assassinated in January 1963. French involvement was suspected, but official records remain closed to this day. Further attempts were made to conceal French imperialism. The CFA franc was eventually split into two currencies, which covered the Central and West African states. By the mid-1970s, their respective central banks were Africanized and relocated to Yaoundé and Dakar. While the African central banks were staffed by local Africans, there were no significant policy changes. France retained veto power over the bank's governing statutes, which required member states to deposit half of their exchange reserves at the French treasury, along with another 20% for financial liabilities. This arrangement meant that member states only had access to 30% of their own money. Furthermore, the method of operation for fiscal policy concerning foreign exchange conversions mandates that all transactions must go through the French treasury. This process is carried out via special accounts, known as operation accounts, which are held at the French treasury in euros denomination. The African central banks, by placing their foreign exchange reserves in these accounts, effectively provide France with access to their funds. However, when the central bank's accounts reflect a debit balance, they become obligated to pay interest to the French treasury. In essence, member states of the CFA pay France to safeguard their funds, and the lack of transparency regarding the French treasury's use of these funds is a cause for concern. Even member states of the CFA franc nations are not privy to this information, leaving open the possibility that France could use African funds for its own benefit. Regardless of how you approach it, the CFA system proves to be a profitable venture for France, with both French businesses and the French treasury reaping its benefit. France no longer needs to utilize its foreign exchange reserves to pay for African imports, with numerous French multinational corporations such as Total Energies, Arriva, and Vinci operating within Africa. Additionally, Africa provides France access to crucial resources, including uranium, which is vital for France's nuclear energy industry, meeting 75% of its energy requirements. For instance, Gabon is a primary source of crude oil, Mauritania is a supplier of iron ore, and Togo and Benin contribute agricultural commodities. To add to this, it is worth noting that the French state-owned company Vinci Boulevard holds the majority of West Africa's major ports. Former French President Jacques Chirac even acknowledged that a significant portion of the funds in French banks were a result of exploiting African resources. He went on to state that France's global position would be jeopardized without its African empire. To maintain its dominance, France has engaged in military interventions on the African continent on 40 occasions since the 1960s. These interventions range from supporting corrupt leaders to conducting military operations in the Sahel region. Furthermore, the structure of the CFA franc system enables the easy repatriation of profits and capital. For instance, between 1970 and 2010, Ivory Coast lost $40 billion to capital flight. If this money had been reinvested domestically, it could have reduced poverty by 10% annually. Similarly, Equatorial Guinea and Congo, the primary oil producers, transferred out the equivalent of 43% and 30% of their respective GDPs between 2000 and 2009. Gabon and Cameroon exhibit similar trends, with opulence at the top, causing misery for those at the bottom. While some may argue that the stability of the CFA franc is beneficial, the lack of monetary sovereignty limits the tools available to member states. For example, although Ivory Coast has an inflation rate below 6% compared to its neighbor Ghana's 29%, the extreme poverty rate in Ghana is only 13%, whereas it is 30% in the Ivory Coast. Additionally, CFA franc member states have fallen behind other African countries in terms of economic growth, with some even experiencing a decline. For instance, Ivory Coast's real GDP per capita is 1/3 lower than it was in 1978, and as of 2016, Senegal was at its 1960 level. Cameroon, Congo, and Gabon have not surpassed their respective peaks of 1986, 1984, and 1976, indicating little to no real economic growth in these countries for decades. Despite the challenges, change is an inevitable part of life, and in recent years, the societies of CFA Franc member states have become increasingly vocal about the need for alternatives. One proposal gaining traction is to establish a regional currency bloc independent of French control. Proponents of this plan suggest using the West African Economic and Monetary Union, or WAEMU, as a starting point, which would reorient CFA Franc member states around Nigeria. With Nigeria accounting for over 2/3 of the regional GDP and being a net oil exporter, there is a natural synergy in the ECOWAS region. It's important to note that achieving such a significant change will not be easy, as Paris has attempted to prevent these efforts. In fact, in January 2021, the French Senate passed legislation seeking to change the West African CFA franc to the ECO, abolishing the operations, accounts, and withdraw French personnel from central banks by 2027. However, France will still retain effective control over where African monetary reserves would be held, and this location remains unclear. Given these circumstances, it is reasonable to assume that the French reform may be nothing more than a deceptive measure. In the end, the optimal resolution could involve each state having its own central bank and currency pegged to a common regional unit at a flexible exchange rate. This arrangement would enable monetary independence for 14 nations, encompassing nearly 200 million people. However, there are concerns about the potential repercussions of challenging French dominance, and consequently, any attempts to move away from the CFA franc zone would necessitate a collective endeavor involving collaboration across Africa. It would also require sidelining the elites who benefit from the current system and replacing them with policymakers who are committed to pursuing a self-directed development path. It is possible that this could present a major obstacle, and it is a matter that requires internal change. It is easy to become content with the way things are, but this can also be detrimental. What do you think? How should these African nations implement change? Comment your thoughts below. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, click the like button and subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated.